Well, our live stream looked reasonable, but unfortunately the sound was pretty bad. So for those who missed out on the sermon over the weekend, I'm going to tell you about Ruth 3 right now. Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Do you believe that God works in all things for the good of his purpose in your life? I think Ruth tells us a lot about this, doesn't it? In our last episode in our Ruth mini-series, we discovered God had set up the conditions for Naomi and Ruth to be cared for. But today we're going to see a development in the story in episode 3, which is kind of like Pride and Prejudice. And I think Jane Austen may have taken some of her plot of Pride and Prejudice from Ruth here. Why do I say that? Well, the pragmatic mother-in-law, it's not mother, but mother-in-law is seeking a husband for her daughter-in-law and also to save the family estate from ruin. There's a good, kind man who does the honourable thing to provide for his relations. But I guess above that, or underneath that, is also God's incredible kindness, again, in the provision of his law to take care of Naomi and Ruth. Now, this is not a love story. Instead, it's a story of ordinary, struggling people and a snapshot of God's incredible kindness to his people. A kindness that he also shows to you and to me through Jesus. So, do you believe God works for the good of those who love him? Well, let's look at the development of our three main people in this story of Ruth. We'll look at Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. So, Naomi. Now, it would have been Naomi's husband who made the decision for the family to leave Bethlehem and to go to Moab to try and get some relief from this crippling famine, which was against what God wanted for the family. And we see the outcome of this. Naomi loses her husband, Elimelech. She loses her sons, and really she loses all but one of her daughters-in-law for company too. Only in bitter desperation does she go back to Bethlehem, but she is bitter towards God. You remember she calls herself Mara, which means bitter. And she complains bitterly about this. She says in Ruth 1:21, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So when she returns to Bethlehem with Ruth, and Ruth begins the gleaning and comes back with that ephah of food, do you remember the 13 kilos? Well, it dawns on Naomi that God may be beginning to answer her prayers. God had already set it up for good for Naomi by Ruth meeting Boaz and gleaning by chance in his field. God puts things in place for you and me too. Now, we can't see him doing this in our circumstances day by day, but God is always doing this for us. And he does what is good for his own name and, of course, for his people. That's you and me. So for Naomi, God had already put into place yet another act of kindness, and in this case, it's God's law of the guardian redeemer, or the kinsman redeemer is another way of saying it. So let's talk a bit about the kinsman redeemer. Now you remember, Naomi owns the land of her now deceased husband Elimelech, but due to Naomi's hardship, it looks like that land is going to be lost. But God's law reveals his kindness again. I had a look through Leviticus and some of the earlier Old Testament and gleaned really what a guardian redeemer can do. So I'm going to list them in front of you. I'll read them out. This guardian redeemer can reclaim a field lost in times of financial or family distress. That's Leviticus 25:25. They can reclaim a family member out of slavery. That's Leviticus 25:47. They can avenge the death of a family member. That's in Numbers 35. Well, I don't think Boaz needed to do that, but I guess it's up his sleeve. And number 4, marry a relative's widow to care for her and have a child. That's Deuteronomy 25:25. Well, a tick to that. This is anticipating what's going to happen. Now, the idea behind this guardian redeemer was to preserve God's covenant people, the Israelites, to preserve the families. And his faithfulness is the key God here. So caring for family took precedence over personal ambition and personal wealth, so that God's name could be preserved for generation to generation and carried through to the next generation. God is kind. It's built into his law. So Ruth and Naomi had the right to ask Boaz to be that redeemer protector according to the law of Moses. With that glimmer of hope, Naomi activates. You remember at the end of chapter 1, she was bitter and empty and was purposeless. Now that there's a glimmer of hope, like with you and me, when we have that glimmer of hope, we have a new energy. Well, that's what's happening with Naomi here. She becomes like Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, I reckon. Have a look at what she does here in Ruth 3. She sees the opportunity for her daughter-in-law with Boaz, the relative of Elimelech. And so she dresses Ruth up and she says, okay, Ruth, go. And, show Boaz your interest. Naomi moves in this episode 3, from bitter despair to hope and she's re-energized in her hope. And this is what God does for you and me. He gives us hope through his son Jesus where there is no hope. He constantly re-energizes us. Why? Because he's kind. He cares for his people. Well, let's now change tack and let's go to Ruth, shall we? What about Ruth? She is a wonderful daughter-in-law, a dream. So loyal, so committed to her mother-in-law's welfare. She's the ideal, faithful person. In fact, that is the case for you and me. She is the role model of faith in God for you and me. We look to her, we see what she does, what she acts like, her loyalty to her mother-in-law and to the law of God. God blesses her for that faithfulness. Naomi, in fact, says about Ruth in verse 11 of chapter 3 of Ruth, all the people of my town know you are a woman of noble character. What a wonderful description. And Ruth is willing to take the risk, isn't she, in this episode, to go to this celebration. Boaz is happy and it's the end of the night. She's willing to take the risk to go to this all-male celebration, uncover Boaz's legs, and by that action of hers to show very plainly to him that she's interested in him for marriage, so that Boaz could become their redeemer, who would then bail them out and recover that land for the family and redeem them. This isn't a love story though, is it? No, this is a story about freedom from despair and freedom from captivity. Maybe it is a love story though. Maybe it's a story of God's love to his people, his faithful people, because he's so kind here. Maybe in the sequel to Ruth, we would see the love story develop between Ruth and Boaz. But you know what? God didn't make a sequel, so we just got what we've got. Did you notice something about Ruth chapter 3 here, about what Ruth does though? She is loyal to God's law. She obeys the law. She goes to Boaz knowing that he could be a potential guardian redeemer for her family. And she trusts in God's law that will be the case, which is pretty fantastic. Now, Boaz clearly gets it that Ruth's making this offer of marriage. You see there in verses 10 to 13. And the story is now taking a turn for the better. So this is a nice episode in our mini-series of Ruth, isn't it? Well, let's go to Boaz. Now, we all need a Boaz in our life, don't we? He is such a good man. He is God's man. And he's going to prove to be the Redeemer. He's wealthy too. And we see he's going to be able to absorb the cost of taking care of Ruth's issues with the land and Naomi's issues, He's going to really rescue them from their poverty and free them from it. Why? Because God has already set up the conditions for Ruth and Naomi to be freed. He's a kind God. Can we talk about kindness for a bit? Kindness is such a wonderful virtue, isn't it? We all remember wonderful acts of kindness shown to us in our own lives, don't we? It's so good to be able to be kind to somebody else. And when we're kind to somebody else, or someone is kind to us, that's when we see the Spirit of God at work in that person or in us, because kindness is a fruit of the Spirit. Now, Boaz sees the kindness of Ruth towards him, and he honours that kindness with showering Ruth with abundance. He knows very well that there are a bunch of younger blokes who Ruth could have gone to the feet at, but no, she chooses God, loyalty to her mother-in-law and to Boaz. So Boaz showers her with his kindness. There's this abundance of barley that he gives to Ruth in verse 17. And even though there's some tension here, because Boaz is actually second in line to be this guardian redeemer for the family, so there's a bit of tension. We need that to resolve, and it will in our final episode next week. We're all anticipating, though, something really great and miraculous is going to happen in our final episode. But you'll have to come back next week for that. Think back over your Christian life. Think of all the kindnesses you've received at the hands of others, the generosity of others, the answered prayers that have been given to you through the prayers of others. Think of the times when Christians have really saved your bacon when you're in a bit of trouble. When we organise our lives around Christ and let him lead us, well, God showers us, doesn't he, with every spiritual blessing. That's in Ephesians 1. We're saved by grace. We're justified by faith. We're part of the elected for glory. These are rich spiritual blessings. But also, God showers us with his hesed. Do you remember from last time? His steadfast love. Now in Ruth, we see God's promises being lived out, don't we? Through those three accounts of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. It's a wonderful account, isn't it? And we see that the indulgent, generous grace of God is at work. And his indulgent grace is at work in you too right now, through Christ. Do you believe that? God just asks us to trust him with that this is happening, to trust in his Son, trust in him, because God is always full of lavish grace. He showers you with it. He wants you to have his grace, and he wants to give it to you every day. Now, like Boaz has done with Ruth and Naomi by, we hope at least in the next episode, freeing them from their captivity to this poverty, well, you know what? Christ has absorbed the cost of our sin and our poverty, a state of poverty with him, by taking our sin and shame and guilt and nailing it to the cross. That's his ultimate expression of lavish grace towards us. And he keeps redeeming all the situations we face. So I love Boaz for that reason, because he's like a little foretaste of Jesus, isn't he? The way he cares and honours the faith of Ruth. We don't deserve his grace, but even in his complaining, God shows us his steadfast love, thanks to his Son. So let me finish today. Are you feeling bitter towards God today for any reason? Something troubling you, you're not right with God. Can I just suggest some small practical tips for you? If you're in a bit of frame of mind with God, what can you thank God for today? Can you write it down? When you wake up in the morning, just say, Lord, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to thank you for something you've done for me. At the end of the day, can you look back over your day and say to God, well, God, I can see that you were present in my day here, here and here. That's where I can see it, even though it's all the time. Can you try that for a week and see how you go? Maybe, a little book or a journal to help you. And I hope and pray that you'll see God's kindness through that week. Tell me how you go. Because God has already set all things good up for you already. Through his Redeemer, Jesus Christ, and he's taken all your sin and shame and guilt away. What a blessing. But hey, the final episode is next week. Please be patient next week if you're at home. Check out the live stream. We will fix all the audio problems. They were terrible, we admit it. please try it again, and we'll enjoy seeing you next week online. Bye for now.